Thanks for joining us today. I have the great pleasure to have a fireside chat with a pioneering AI scientist, an entrepreneur, an investor, and I guess in his ample spare free time, a best-selling author. Kai-Fu Lee is the author of the 2018 book AI Superpowers, and he's joining us from literally the other side of the world. Kai-Fu, thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
I want to start by asking you a question that I get asked a lot about the books that I've written. In the time since AI Superpowers came out, we're at about 3 years now, which is kind of an eternity in internet web time. What have you learned?
I think a lot of the key points I made in AI Superpowers turned out to be correct, that data turned out to be the determining factor of making value out of AI, and that China, with its surplus of data and tenacious entrepreneurs, created these platforms that use AI and monetize that. I think that part was true. Some surprises that I did not anticipate. I think one was that how fast the global research network was truly connected, that as new technologies were being invented, they were being globally replicated instantaneously, even faster than I thought. And I think another interesting thing that has emerged is that AI has become kind of a negative term very rapidly in the last 3 years. I think when the book was published, people were fascinated by AI, and that part of the book appealed to a lot of people. But now, with a lot of issues that came out, like on the documentary Social Dilemma, issues about privacy and security, deep fakes, I think it's kind of giving AI a bad name. So anyway, so I decided to correct that. So I have written a new book, AI 2041. This is the Chinese edition, but the English one is coming out in 2 months, to tell you why the future with AI is actually going to be pretty good after all.
Okay, now I want to talk about this a little bit, because the book is actually a work of fiction.
Yes, I want to make I want to describe the future in 2041 in as scientifically accurate a way as I possibly could. And I want to make it accessible so people can see there will be alternate endings. Some stories are positive, others are negative, but by and large, they're constructive. But I wanted people to really have fun reading them, get involved, and then leave the book with a strong conviction that a constructive world is possible. So the only way to do that is to write great fiction, which I cannot do. And that's why I have a co-author who is a best-selling science fiction writer in China. And I wrote the technology roadmap, he wrote the stories, and then I wrote the commentaries.
Now, this is a real example of cross-disciplinary partnership. You talk about the possible endings and the fact that the book includes a lot of scenarios. Give us a little preview. Are most of those scenarios positive?
Yes, they're mostly positive. We have examples of what happens in the future when jobs have been displaced and the routine jobs have been displaced. And then we hypothesize that there would be virtual worlds in which people have to work and they can't distinguish whether jobs are real or not. But it's actually a test for people to see if they can make it. If they can, then they get a real job. If they cannot, they keep doing the virtual job that they think is the real job. So that's an example. You can call it a positive ending or not. We have another story about a more negative story would be one where autonomous weapons becomes deployed by some evil person modeled after the Unabomber. And I don't want to give away the ending of the story, but he funds his terrorist activities by using the first quantum computer to steal all the
That's tying about 3 different current themes together. The book is called AI 2041. I have an advanced English copy of it. I can't wait to read it. We're looking forward to that book coming out. But back up a step. You said you decided to write this because the feeling or the conversation about AI has turned so sharply negative, even just the 3 years since your book came out. Do you have an explanation as for why that is? Because I share that view and I'm a little bit puzzled about why we've gone from being kind of excited and hopeful about AI in a relatively short space of time to being quite negative about it. Do you know why that is?
Well, I think part of it is just media and social media sensationalism. People
Yeah.
want to read nasty things. The same reason why social media has turned negative on many things. It's kind of affected AI. So, crashes of the autonomous vehicle get the big headline, uh, Congress wanting to talk to the big companies about what bad things they do with AI. That gets the headline. AI inventing new drugs gets no coverage. AI manages to fold proteins. That gets no coverage. So
Right.
that's part of it. But I think another part of it is that with the advent of any new technology will come a series of challenges and consequences. The internet connected to the PC brought viruses, right?
Yeah.
Uh, Inventing electricity caused people to be electrocuted. But ultimately, we technologists found solutions, the circuit breaker for the electrocution
Yep.
and antivirus software for the viruses. So I think we, the technologists, should be given a little bit more time and patience to find solutions which work alongside the regulations, which we also need. And these problems ought to be significantly reduced, if not eliminated, in due time.
Is this pervasive negativity about AI? Does this worry you? Is this a minor thing, or this could be a big enough deal to shape the trajectory of how we use this technology or cause it to use it less than we should?
Well, it's a good and bad thing, right? The bad thing is if everybody's worried about AI and autonomous vehicles and they don't buy cars with that feature, they're afraid to ride in robo taxis, then technologies won't take off. That's the negative thing. There's of course also a positive angle because of such concern about AI being single-mindedly monetizing for the big companies and
Mm.
hurting our privacy and brainwashing us, then there might be some kind of ESG for AI companies
Ah,
or some kind of a third-party watchdog that measures percentage of fake news on social media. There might be government regulations that actually work out pretty well. There might be technologies invented that will protect our privacy. So I think it's double-sided. So I don't obsess over it. I
you
just
don't
hope
obsess over it.
it doesn't keep going negative because at some point it becomes really difficult to change something that's already become a final outcome in people's minds.
One last question on this. One of the reasons I love talking to you is because you have a foot in both worlds, both huge domains where the innovation is taking place. Is the same negativity that we see here in the United States, is it also present in China about AI?
I would say the same negativity about large, powerful internet AI companies is present in the society.
Interesting. Okay.
But probably not as much about new AI technologies. I think people in China tend to like to try new technologies, mostly because it has worked out for the better over time, right?
Yeah.
People tried mobile phone. Oh, wow, that's great. And then they tried mobile internet. That's great. Mobile payment. So imagine a Pavlovian response where you keep showing a country
Good
more
things, right?
technology and they keep trying it and it keeps resulting in positive outcome. I think there's going to be more willingness. There hasn't been as much kind of the negative issues like Cambridge Analytica that has hit China yet. So maybe some huge negative event will change this. But so far, people are willing to try new technologies, including AI technologies. They're just a little bit unhappy on the average about large companies having too much power.
I want to encourage everybody to feel free to ask questions to Kai-Fu. We'll have some time for that at the end. Kai-Fu, we're here at the Platform Summit, so I want to switch a little bit away from AI and toward platforms. I've heard you kind of broadly compare and contrast American platforms versus Chinese platforms. Is this still an important distinction? And if so, can you give us that compare and contrast exercise?
Sure, I think it is in several ways. I think first, the way in which platforms emerge in China is in a tenacious, competitive environment that I call the gladiatorial fight to the death in a winner-take-all environment. And when I say winner-take-all, I mean really mean all. In the US, obviously, there has been Groupon and its copycats, Yelp and its copycats.
Okay.
But the competition ends when Yelp wins and Groupon wins and OpenTable wins, and DoorDash and Uber Eats are still fighting it out. Eventually, it'll be a duopoly or one of them will win. And you'd think there's already competition and the winner has taken place. But in China, the Colosseum is much bigger. So the Yelp of China has had to compete with the Groupon of China, with the OpenTable of China, with the DoorDash of China. Eventually, only one survives, and it's Meituan, the giant super app. And it has all of the functions of all of the companies I talk about. So the positive side is that it's incredibly convenient. If I want to know about any food or restaurant or groceries or delivery, it's a reservation, or Michelin. In fact, it has launched its own Michelin competitor. So it's a one super app that contains everything about food. It's incredibly convenient and fast and economic and good for me. However, one might argue that this could become a powerful monopoly that could stifle innovation. But I would argue that it really hasn't done that, because in an ultra competitive environment, everyone has to basically be extremely cautious and paranoid about someone jumping in to eat your lunch. And that has happened. There was a giant payment company called Alipay, owned by Ant Financial. WeChat Pay jumped in with what Alibaba calls the Pearl Harbor, and through a couple of tactics, took away half the users overnight. Not overnight, over like 6 months. And similarly, Taobao, you would think, has everything covered. They're like the Amazon and eBay combination, powerful e-commerce giant. But Pinduoduo came in and took over. And then WeChat, you would think, is all powerful, but then the TikTok equivalent called Douyin jumped in and took a bunch of share. So I think when you have tenacious, hungry entrepreneurs, they will cross colosseums and keep everybody on their toes. So it really hasn't stifled innovation, but it certainly
I'm sorry, go ahead.
But it certainly has made life for small companies difficult. It certainly gives them inordinate power. They certainly connect lots of data and all the things you worry about in America about Facebook and Google. It might even be a little bit worse in China.
We Americans like to think that we have very hungry entrepreneurs in competitive markets and a big market, but you point out this fascinating difference that the Chinese platforms seem to just jump across boundaries in a way that the American platforms don't, even as they grow big and as they mature. Again, I want to ask you for your explanation about why that is, because you describe this pretty profound difference between the two biggest platform markets out there.
Yeah, I think there are fundamentally two reasons. The first, I think, is the Silicon Valley culture that really rewards and honors innovation and doing things no one has done before. Whereas I think the Chinese culture is more practical. So for a company, let's say like Google, they wouldn't think building a social network that looks like Facebook would be a very honorable thing to do. And on the other hand, in China, people would do it, without even thinking twice, because if that helps the business, they would do it. So, and also, I think going back to the food analogy, it wouldn't occur to OpenTable that they should also build an Yelp. And it wouldn't occur to Yelp, maybe they should also build a DoorDash. But it's like second nature in China that you keep extend, because it comes with the power of the total platform or super app. So people have come to call these things super apps.
Super apps.
Yeah, a super app is WeChat. I spend about 80% of my time in WeChat because it
Wait,
includes
in one app,
in one app. I'm
you do
sorry.
all the things that it takes me 20 apps to do. You basically do 80% of that in one.
Yes, and that's good
Wow.
and bad, as you know,
Okay.
because Apple tracks that, and I'm shocked. I don't want to, but I do, and it
Ah,
actually saves me time because now I can do payments and group chats and family videos and look at frivolous things and look at news and pay my bills and also in the pandemic, it's also the green passport or the to prove that you don't have COVID. So
wait, really?
yes, it's an ecosystem.
Okay.
So if you don't have WeChat, you basically can't get in or out of quarantine spaces or into buildings
Wow.
which only admit safe people.
Wow.
Yeah, of course, now pandemic's better, so people don't always check that. But during the tough days, you can't even get around without your phone and WeChat.
Now,
Now, it's
if
either WeChat or Alipay. So there's two choices.
I see. Now, if I try to impersonate an American regulator right now, I would get very, very nervous and say, man, that kind of dominance in that many different domains starts to sound like a monopoly and starts to sound anti-competitive and starts to sound like something we we need to be vigilant about, maybe take action on. But you point out this phenomenon that the currently dominant platform took over from the previously dominant platform. Do you think this pattern is going to continue, and that, for example, WeChat is not guaranteed to be as dominant in 5 years or 10 years as it is today? Or do you think that at some point this one super app is just going to lock in and kind of dominate this big market?
No, I think new technology trends and breakthroughs, and new revelations and ideas will continue to jump from superpower to superpower. So there will be new chance for new entrants as well as change of ranking among existing powers. This
Right.
happens in America too, except it just doesn't happen as often. In China, the leadership changes all the time, faces all the time. But in the US, remember when IBM was super dominant, nobody thought they could be dislodged. Then Microsoft, then Google, right? So I think it's a natural phenomenon. But coming back to what you said, I'm not saying they don't need to be regulated.
Okay.
In fact, the Chinese government is also looking at how to regulate these giant super apps.
Taifu, one of the things I love about talking with you is you kind of portray the US tech industry as a comparatively slow moving and sleepy place compared to what you see in China. And I just think that's just an amazing way to look at this situation. We're going to open it up to questions from the audience in just a second. So please get them in. I want to switch and ask specifically about platforms, because one of the things I remember you saying over and over is that it kind of feels like the online space is dividing into an American sphere and a Chinese sphere. But we've recently seen at least one really popular example of jumping across that boundary, which is, of course, TikTok. Do you think that's a sign of things to come? And will we see more boundary jumping platforms and apps? And if so, will that boundary jumping be in both directions or just one direction?
I actually don't think there will be too many jumping beyond TikTok.
Really?
Uh, on the one hand, I do think China now has an emergent class of very capable product managers and AI people, data people, engineering people. So theoretically, the U.S. and China engineering teams could battle it out and try to send apps to the other side and so on. But I don't think it's going to happen. Partly just because there are beginning to be regulations, right? TikTok
Okay.
almost got kicked out of the US.
Yeah.
And I think that may go both ways for future such occurrences. But the other issue is that it's really not natural. If I were a Chinese entrepreneur, I would first priority is to develop local, because that's my space, my culture, my language,
And it's a huge market.
huge market. And then if you had to go somewhere, I would go to emerging countries where the
Ah,
demographics and the needs
right,
are more similar. The
right.
US young people and Chinese young people have some commonalities, as
Okay.
TikTok has
That's-
demonstrated. But I think when you start to go into e-commerce and deeply social applications, one might find that many of the features might not be such a good fit.
That relates to a question that just came in from the audience. As an investor, when you are looking at a startup platform play, what do you look for? And is there any level of recipe for success or a checklist that you mentally go down when you're evaluating a new platform?
Yeah, as an investor in an early startup, we as a principle don't invest in platforms because all platforms are basically built out of applications. So first you build a really powerful application and you
Great.
gain enough power on that one side, then you build the other side. So platforms are built over time.
Mhm.
So, WeChat initially was just a chat app, and now it's become a platform. So I guess another way to ask the
So you look for a killer app, a killer thing, and it can broaden out from there.
yeah, and then so in that killer thing, I would look for, the velocity of growth of users, how sticky it is, how they can't do without it, daily active usage, and so on. And from that, I would be helping to assess whether there are platform opportunities once that killer app has established itself.
Fantastic. I'm interested that to learn that you're not scared away from investing in things that could become platforms, even though you've got this giant that takes up 80% of your time these days.
Right. Both in US and China, there's not one social network, there's not one, e-commerce site. And we see, especially in China, things change so quickly. One of the things that changed a lot is actually e-commerce. It's probably no time to discuss in detail here, but there's a paper by Connie Chan of Andreessen Horowitz
Hmm.
that very well described the recent substantial changes in the China e-commerce landscape. And I think that may be very much a good idea for Silicon Valley entrepreneurs to study that because those might make sense in the US too.
Can you give us an example of a couple of those changes?
Yeah, basically, basically taking away the power of the Amazon-like portal because our
Wow.
human tendencies are not just to buy things when we know the name and search for it,
Okay.
nor to look at things that we bought in the past and get suggested. In fact, I would argue a large percentage of things that we buy as human beings are things that we were enticed or tricked or convinced that we should buy them because
When we didn't
someone.
even know that we had the need.
That's right. That's right.
Ah,
And maybe after we buy it, we don't actually need it, but someone that we believe or love or
I see.
trust or worship, or maybe a celebrity said we should get it, then we should get it. So a lot of China's new e-commerce steps are how to take video-based celebrity or social uh,
Ha.
streams that make it entertaining for you to watch, and by the end, uncontrollably buy. And that has a big impact because people impulse buy a lot more in China nowadays, and they buy less from Taobao and JD.
Wow.
And the power is now shifting from e-commerce, traditional e-commerce portals,
Okay.
into social and video platforms, which is the platform side, perhaps the most interesting observation.
And if I'm hearing you right, you will not be surprised if more of that happens in the States in the future.
That's right. And if I had a clone, I would be in the U.S. looking at the great Chinese ideas and starting them as U.S. companies.
Okay, so we just need to perfect cloning technology. Um, One of the things that we spend a lot of time um, focused on in the States when it comes to AI is the fact that some systems that have been trained up and in some cases deployed don't do as good a job of recognizing um, women in some cases, people of color in some cases, blacks in some cases. In other words, Kai-Fu, I don't need to tell you that if you train up the system on a biased set, you're going to get of data, you're going to get very biased results. Is the problem with AI bias, have I described it correctly, or is it actually bigger and broader than that? And if so, how do we deal with it? Is it just garbage in, garbage out, or is there a more pervasive problem?
I think there is a more pervasive problem. But first, addressing your question about the bias, I think the best way to address it is education of AI engineers, that this is their responsibility to fix not just accuracy, but avoid bias and making sure their systems are fair, and also building better AI tools so that they will spot for potential biases and perhaps not even launch them, just like compilers would catch bugs and not allow you to finish compiling a program. So I think that's more or less solvable. Where it gets tricky is what if some politically incorrect bias actually makes the right way for the bank to loan money. Okay. I can give any examples, but no, okay, I'll give one since I'm Chinese. So hypothetically, let's say Chinese people just don't repay loans as well as other people. Okay. Then should a bank use that feature? Are you really going to remove the racial feature from each person's record? And if you do, my name gives away my ethnicity as well. Are you going to remove that? If you do that, then my zip code does it too. So I think when you're thinking about the ultimate fairness, it leads to a continual removal of features until your AI is useless. So how do we tackle that problem? That one I don't know.
And you point out that this is actually a deep issue, because when it comes to things like allocating credit, the goal is to discriminate. You want to give the money to people who will repay the loan.
That's right. So reasonable people will disagree on this issue.
Great. Kai-Fu, we have time for one more question. Here's a quick one. I love this one that came in. You just wrote or co-wrote some AI fiction. What AI fiction or visions of the future have you enjoyed the most or found most resonant and relevant?
Well, I love science fiction myself. I guess that's the question. I love Black Mirror. I like,
even though it's dystopian all the time.
Yeah, because they get me thinking. It's dystopian most of the time, and I think I can come up with alternate endings. But their plots and story and technology are pretty reasonable. And so that actually inspired me that I should do something like a White Mirror, which is more or less what our book is about.
Fantastic. AI 2041 comes out in a couple months in English. We are looking forward to it. Kai-Fu, thank you for taking time out of your evening to join us. This has been fantastic. I always learn a ton. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Andrew. Thanks. Bye-bye.